We'll talk about that.
It's quite poor. Hello and welcome. My name is Ian. This channel is all about music and art. And this is where we talk about music and art. And in this video, I'm going to look back at what's happening regarding music streaming in the UK. And over the last couple of months, the UK government's Digital Culture, Media and Sports Committee have been looking into the way that streaming platforms and large record companies manage payments to songwriters, musicians and performers. And on the 15th of October 2020, Parliament published a news article stating that this particular committee would inquire into the impact of streaming on the future of the music industry. The article stated that the inquiry will consider whether the government should take action to protect the industry from piracy in the wake of steps taken by the EU on copyright and intellectual property rights. I knew that some high-profile musicians were giving evidence to this committee, and the first of these meetings was on the 24th of November and another meeting on the 8th of December. Now these meetings were long, lasting over 3 hours each. So what I've done is I've edited them down into shorter videos, and I have put direct links to the questions in the description down below, which will make it easier for you if you want to look at a specific question and not watch the whole thing. It's worth providing a background to the witnesses giving evidence in session 2. We had Garvey, the singer from Elbow, who is also a BBC 6 music presenter, Ed O'Brien, guitarist, songwriter, singer and musician from Radiohead, and Nadine Shah, who is solo singer, songwriter and musician. All of the sessions were chaired by Julian Knight, and the complete list of committee members and the relevant links are in the description down below. Now this recording is made in agreement with the UK Parliament Terms and Conditions, which state that I cannot alter the video or the audio of the recording in any way. I can't use this material for satire or use it on websites or social media platforms that promote, encourage and facilitate illegal activity and encourage hatred and antisocial behaviour. So here is part 2 of session 2 from the 24th of November 2020 into the economics of music streaming. Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Chair. It's fascinating listening here. I think what's coming out of this is that what you're talking about is the principle of having a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. And that really should apply to musicians as much as it should apply to a dentist, a shop worker or whoever. And clearly what we're hearing is that isn't happening. And what I'd like to draw on is, and it's been alluded to from you all so far, is that Nadine, you've come through and broken through as a musician in a different era to Guy and Ed. And I'm not being ageist here because I'm older than all of you. I'd like you to tell me a little bit about your experience breaking through in the era of digital and streaming. And I'd like to also know about something I asked in the previous panel about what advice, and whether legal or other, you were given when you were signing contracts, when you were just starting to break through. Could you sort of give us a brief picture of your journey, please?
In regards to streaming?
In breaking through in the age of digital and streaming, rather than, and I'm going to ask Ed and Guy this after you, when they broke through, when things were different.
Yeah, well, mine was still in a time where I would look to artists like Ed and Guy, and that was the model that I knew. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden I'm thrust into this new way of working, which is not in relation to the ways that I saw the model work for Ed and for Guy. It was very, very different. And all of a sudden there's this digital era, which was just, I mean, this is my 4th album I just released in June. So it's, 10 years a professional musician. And I'm only just there are people who do what I do much better, who are much more acclimatized and better at working at social media, For one, I hate using social media. It affects my mental health. I don't want to document what I'm eating all the time. I don't really like, there are so much of us as musicians that we have to now, there was a beauty in a time, there was a beauty of mystery, which shrouded a lot of musicians, and you could be mysterious, whereas now that's not the case. And there is so much of us, not only the work that we put into the music that we make, but there is so much else that we have to put into this. Every bit of our being, here's what I'm eating today, here's this, and there's a constant interaction. So I would say the work doesn't end from making the music and then releasing it. It then continues every day. We become these entrepreneurs of sorts, and that's not what I signed up for. But And
did you get advice or support when you were starting to get record deals or whatever? Did you have any input into what was happening to you as an artist?
I always had a legal representative present, always. And I had a thirst for knowledge, because I had a bad experience years and years ago with a big manager, years and years ago, to do with the singing competition. And so I wanted to read up, and I wanted to provide myself with the tools to enable myself to have a bit of protection on my own. But I did have legal representation with me every time I've signed a contract, every single time. And most musicians do. I hope that that's a case for all musicians. But the landscape is changing all the time. The landscape is constantly changing, and it's not working.
So, I mean, it's very brave of you to talk about the fact that somebody as successful as you is not financially really earning enough to provide the basics. That's clearly wrong. And what do you think should change? What would make the difference to you as an artist to be able to make a reasonable living for what you do?
Okay, so a meaningful
Yes.
income is what I ask for.
Yeah.
I don't want to throw anybody under a bus either. And, so what Tom Gray was saying earlier on about equitable remuneration, equating equal pay for equal work, right? Yes. And then a meaningful income from streaming. And I truly believe that it's entirely possible to fix streaming and to make it work for everyone, the labels, the streaming platforms, and the artists.
It just needs levelling out.
I think so.
Yeah.
Definitely. It needs to be made, it has to be fairer. Because I think right now, presently, it's wrong.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it is wrong and it is unfair.
Thank you. And Guy and Ed, can you tell me a little bit about your experience coming through, what was different, and what you think perhaps has changed to the negative for people starting out now? I mean, you're both at a position where, you're successful, you've got a good life out of being musicians, and that's where Nadine should be able to get to, and others should be able to get to. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience and what you think needs to change to put this right?
It's interesting because we signed in 1991, and we signed what was a very traditional deal at the time that put us essentially on about a 12% royalty.
And were you given advice on that?
I mean, we did our homework. We really did our homework, because we realized that a lot of bands we saw bands from Oxford that weren't making it because they didn't have the right setup. So the first thing, it was like, get the best legal advice. So we'd got the best legal advice. It was a guy called John Kennedy at the time. And, but there were certain parameters so for instance, when we were signing, we signed a 6-album deal with EMI at the time. And the thing that always grated, that was always hard to accept, was that we were signing over the copyright for life. That the record company, they give you that, they, as part of the deal of promoting you and investing in you and marketing you, they earn. So, but there was no room for maneuver. You heard the odd example of a band or an artist who was being, there was a bidding war going on, and they were able to negotiate that. I think the Rolling Stones, Andrew Loog Oldham, back in the 60s, managed to get them a licensing deal with Decca at the beginning, which was highly unusual. But, you know, ours was a very standard contract. And it was all the things that you heard in the first session about tour support, and there was a big investment. And we were obviously very lucky because we had a song on the first album that was a worldwide hit, the only worldwide hit that we had. So it kept us sort of on parity. The money that was invested in us came back through the sales of the first album. So again, I'm not a great example, but what I saw in a lot of bands as well at the same time, you know, it was hard on a lot of bands, and there are a lot of artists now, and maybe, you know, the same kind of legacy artists who didn't have the success of Radiohead, who are on those same royalties, i.e. they're still on, equates to a sort of a 12% royalty or whatever from a pre-digital era. And their contracts now in the digital era, and when they're being streamed, they're still getting that same royalty rate. Their royalty rate hasn't gone up, so they're not seeing anything. They might have unrecouped. So, you know, it's so back to your question, how is it for younger artists? I think it's always been tough for artists. I just think it's even more murky now with the lack of transparency, the opaqueness in the system, the fact that some parties are making, you know, some partners are making huge amounts of money, some of the labels and stuff like that. I think it's always been tough, but it feels like it's tougher now. There's less money, you know, artists are really, really on the breadline.
And Guy, thank you. And Guy, your experience and particularly your experience, you've said, you know, as somebody who works in radio, where you just see artists disappear as well. Do you ever get any feedback or knowledge on what's actually making them disappear?
It's difficult to talk about without naming artists because the circumstances are so specific. And as I sort of alluded to earlier, anybody who's not come forward is not comfortable with coming forward. Yeah. I'm hoping that will change. I just want to stress that again. I hope that we can, throughout these proceedings, hear more evidence from a more varied group of artists. But my experiences with the band, we've been a band for 30 years. Nothing happened with us for the first 7 of those years. Arguably, we were unlistenably bad initially, getting less bad as time went on. But then around the time it started sounding good, there was interest. The interest grew. And then we were signed to Island Records. We made our first album in a studio with the remarkable Steve Osborne. We'd never seen a studio, let alone worked in one. We learned so much in there through his wealth of skill, because one of the casualties of this whole system is how little producers are valued. In fact, Ed's long-standing collaborator, Nigel Godrich, equated it to, we don't know how they made the doors of Notre Dame Cathedral. We've lost the skills because it can't be written in a manual. And it's the same with the generations of rock producer coming from accurately miking things up to being an integral part of the sound, like with the Beach Boys and the Beatles, and then eventually with Radiohead. Those kind of skills are going by the wayside, because without investment, without an income, there's no investment, because you're not expected to make anything. And without investment, how can you afford to go and let your art grow in a studio environment? Anyway, in terms of my experience, I got with Elbow to work in that way. We were dropped before the first record came out. And then we were scooped up by V2, who were an independent label. We remade the album. We remade the first album, and it was nominated for Mercury. And that sent us on a very slow ascent, which we were very, very happy with. And then in 2008, we had our international hit. And that put us on a different level. And as I say, we've been incredibly lucky, because Island, despite not having released a record with them, the experience we got, and we got to work with Steve, And then through V2 and working with Ben, who co-writes and produces Nadine. And then after V2, we signed to Fiction with Polydor, and we're with Polydor now. Fiction with Universal, and now with Polydor Universal. Everybody we've ever worked with remains a friend because we had an amazing, creative, nurturing experience. And it's because there was a budget there, and there was room to breathe and grow. And I remember our agent, Jeff Kraft, saying very confidently on our first meeting when we were making the first album, nothing significant's going to happen with you lot till your fourth album. And he was disturbingly right. It's not what we wanted to hear then, but it's that sort of long, forward-thinking, nurturing, that's disappearing. And it's disappearing because of the instant nature of streaming. And it doesn't have to be that way. Streaming...
What do you think can be changed? What do you think that we can recommend to change to make that change?
Well, I think that the user-centric streaming model for the new music that I'm talking about, that needs a hand just to keep living, just to pay the rent. So I don't want to call it niche. It grows over time. The stuff of value rather than, not that there's no value in instantaneous, likable music. Of course it's valuable, but there are different kinds of record that you only want to hear once and not 100 times, a week. Not something to dance to, something that hits with you, resonates with you on a personal level. That music just needs an income. It just needs, if there's 80,000 people worldwide, thanks to the internet, which wasn't there when we started out, I was watching this happen and I was thinking, you can connect with your audience without waiting for a guy with a checkbook. You can connect directly through the internet. You can make records in your bedroom. And then slowly as time went on, I thought, I can hear that record's been made in a bedroom, and I can hear that's had no investment, and that's not going to get nurtured. Something as simple as you can't hear what you're saying on a record. That's the first thing a producer does, is turn that fader up, And I hear all this music with such massive potential disappear because they can't make the rent. To answer your question, I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
The user-centric streaming model, I think, ultimately would be very, very valuable. I think there needs to be more transparency as well, as much as possible. And that, I think, involves ultimately, as with all of this, cooperation. But I think the first thing that can be done is equitable remuneration. I still can't say it. ER. I think right at the top, something that isn't negotiated in any way, that's a right to the people who made the thing that you're listening to. I think that is a viable first step that the committee can recommend. I think that is something we could do right now, which would have a lasting effect. So I think as a first step there, as a second step, I would say transparency alongside trying to wrestle into place a way of getting music paid for, not on its popularity, but on how much it means to the person listening to it. If you only listen to Nadine's record, to This Is the Kits album, to Samantha Crane's record, if you only listen to them that month, the depth of your appreciation should be it should be correspondent with where your money goes. That's kind of a moral contract that needs sorting out. I'm not sure how many people know that their artists are not getting paid. There's a sense of ownership when you love a band or a song. It's how often do you hear that's our song, our first dance, and or whatever, and it's kind of like the sense of ownership should come from the fact that you bought it, or that every time you listen to it, you pay for it.
Yeah. It's a bit like I remember when I bought my first record, which shop I went into, and none of these places exist anymore. But that's called getting old. Anyway, thank you very much. That's been really useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Mine was Baggy Trousers by Madness at Woolworths in 1981. Damien Green.
All going to show how old we are. Mine was Roxy Music in the 70s. Absolutely my band. And
which one?
The first album was, I can still remember taking it home and playing it. Anyway, enough of how old I am. I want to pick up one of the points Ed made about the move from analog to digital, which is not just changed the way we listen to music, but also changed the economics of the whole industry. Is it inevitable now that most people are listening to music on streaming. Is that going to benefit established artists over new artists in a way that wouldn't have been true in previous ways that new generations would have listened to music? With the established people's chance first, Ed, what?
Can you say that again?
Sorry, does the fact that the bulk of music is now being listened to on streaming inevitably mean that established artists are going to be favoured because of playlists and so on over new artists that inevitably, definition, nobody's heard of yet?
Yeah, I mean, this is what I think the previous testimonies are saying as well, that the way that it's paid out, the streaming services pay out is benefits the big artists who get, you know, millions and millions and millions of streams. So yeah, it does create a sort of a false, not false, but it creates a sort of a bias within the system for sure. So yeah, I couldn't disagree with that.
And does it matter that there are very few of the British labels left, the sort of traditional labels that haven't been taken over by the majors? Does that make a difference to the economics from the artist's point of view?
Well, I don't know about that. I think it's interesting. I'm as a solo artist, I'm signed with Capitol Records in America, which is part of Universal Music. With Radiohead, we're signed with Beggars Banquet, which is an independent, the big independent British label. And the thing that's interesting in America with Capitol is there have been a lot of British people. You know, the music industry, or the culture. There's a lot of British people at the top of the major record labels. I mean, obviously, you'll know better than me the economics of the fact that whether there isn't an EMI anymore, which is paying, you know, corporation tax in the UK. I don't know about that stuff, and so obviously there's an economic impact. But I think in terms of, you know, we're a global society, so. You know, it reflects that. It reflects that people move, that there are a lot of Brits all over the world doing great stuff in the music industry. So I mean, obviously it'd be nice to have a major that's British, but we've got Beggars Banquet. We've got a lot of great, really thriving independents who are very British in identity.
And Nadine, do you feel that you have a sort of nurturing label that's helping you?
To an extent, yes, but I think that it's important to keep going back to the fact that there are 3 major labels who are recording record sky-high profits, and that musicians aren't seeing a penny of that. Well, maybe a few pennies, but aren't seeing, that's not being reflected in what we're being paid. The discussions with my label, I think actually mine is quite a fair term. I think that there are darker powers at play, and I don't want to speculate too much about too much in relation between certain artists with certain deals with labels and how Spotify may favour them. But I am now acutely aware of my deal, with my digital deal with my label, but only because of this conversation. This is only the past week and a half, and I believe that many artists in the same position as me are not aware of those things.
That's really interesting. I won't probe any further because I can sense this is quite sensitive for you if you speculate on the motives of some of these very powerful people, which is it's instructive for the committee. Maybe Guy, a question is, does the dominance of streaming now influence the way you write music or perform it? Does it actually have a direct effect on the artistry? You're mute, Guy.
There we go. Streaming has only affected Elbow positively so far. I couldn't tell you if we would have made any more money under the old model. I suspect what streaming pays compared to the deal we were on for our physical copies sold, I'm pretty sure we see less money there, but streaming's allowed us to find different markets in the world that we wouldn't have been aware of otherwise. We went to Mexico in January, which seems so long ago. But we went to Mexico in January. We wouldn't have known that we had an audience there if it wasn't for streaming. And I have to say again, I think it is a wonderful thing. I think it's close to being the future. I have to say, where the major labels are concerned, I have to put my hand up for people who I've known and loved within those labels, who I know to be motivated positively, who I know to be motivated to get music out there and to connect music with its listeners in the same way as I'm motivated. I think you get a load of business people together and they start doing business, they'll push it as far as they can before laws tell them to stop. I think that's what happened. I think the consequences, I wonder if this is actually going to be a wake-up call for a lot of the sort of amorphous cloud of major labels that we're talking about. I wonder if individuals are aware of quite how universal these complaints are from the music community. I can't stress enough that I know there to be really, truly good people at record labels right the way to the top whose motivations aren't negative. It's just this has been a land grab. It's been clumsy. It's also subject to all kinds of contracts signed with hundreds of thousands of artists. And of course, historical things need to be made up and improved. As I've said, my interest here is for the music that comes after my generation, to make sure we don't lose that art. That's my main concern. I also don't think any of that is out of our reach. Complicated and murky has been the response I've had to most of the questions to do with why can't we try user-centric for streaming? Why can't we try that model? The reply always comes back, it would be complicated, it might be murky, there may be costs, but nothing hard standing in its way really, other than a bunch of businesses that don't have to try it. And then if you talk about that and you talk about equitable remuneration, again, something else we can do, then you've got a foothold into really transforming this 100-year-old thing that we've got now. You know, I keep coming back to that, and I've got a few questions somewhat. I apologise.
Back to you, Julian.
So thanks for watching. The next video will be a continuation of this second session.